What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. What was hygiene like at the court of Versailles? The court of Versailles, with its well-off aristocrats, gilded halls, and meticulously maintained gardens, is remembered for its opulence. But the reality of French court hygiene revealed that life at Versailles was likely dirtier and smellier than most people imagine. After all, thousands of people lived cheek by jowl in a 17th-century palace without the convenience of modern plumbing. King Louis XIV of France permanently moved his royal court to Versailles in 1682. Though Versailles had originally been a hunting lodge, Louis expanded and remodeled it so that it became a glittering palace worthy of his status as the Sun King. French aristocrats were expected to live there as well. At the palace, etiquette and manners were strictly enforced, highlighting the theatrical nature of courtiers' lives. Living in Versailles, on the other hand, was a completely different story. Based on the practices, knowledge, and assumptions of the time, the aristocrats at Versailles maintained as clean a lifestyle as they could. But like hygiene during the French Revolution, cleanliness at Versailles was not just a way to keep clean, it was also a way of being. Hygiene at Versailles was consistent with other aspects of life at the palace. It was built on artifice. Some of the most intimate acts a person could perform, like cleaning their bodies or producing waste in Versailles toilets, were also social and political acts that demonstrated there was little distinction between public and private life at the elite court of the Sun King. People thought that drinking hot water made you sick. Folks in the 17th century didn't see hot water baths as a pleasurable indulgence or hygienic necessity. In fact, many of them were of the opinion that taking a bath in hot water was harmful to one's health. According to historian Jules Harper, the common belief was that warm water weakened the body and widened the pores, thus allowing diseases to enter. People all over the world, not just in France, found that taking a quick shower was safer and better for their health than soaking in a tub. This was also true of the Sun King. Historians believe he only had 2 baths over the course of his entire life. But that doesn't mean he didn't care about hygiene. Every morning he washed his hands, used perfume and alcohol to scrub his body, and wiped himself down with a towel. Private bathrooms were more like chamber pot cabinets than actual bathrooms. At Versailles, it wasn't always private to answer nature's call. Other members of Louis XIV court, as well as Louis XIV himself, frequently received visitors while seated. Nonetheless, all inhabitants would have had chamber pots or commodes in their private rooms. The higher ranking you were at court, the more likely you would have been to have a small closet in your chambers in which to do your business. The first flush toilet didn't arrive at Versailles until Louis XV, the Sun King's successor, installed one for his personal use in 1738. Public bathrooms were overflowing nightmares. Though inhabitants had commodes and chamber pots in their private chambers, Versailles had public-use latrines. But considering the sheer number of people on the estate, this was a woefully inadequate supply. The combination of minimal toilets and high demand meant the latrines were under a tremendous strain. They frequently overflowed, allowing sewage to seep through the floors and walls into adjacent rooms. People used heavy perfumes which would often make the smell worse. By all accounts, Versailles was epically stinky. As one witness described, "One's gorge rises as a result of the unpleasant odors in the park, gardens, and even the chateau. The communicating passages, courtyards, buildings in the wings, corridors, are full of urine and feces. A pork butcher actually sticks and roasts his pigs at the bottom of the minister's wing every morning. The Avenue St. Cloud is covered with stagnant water and dead cats." So what did courtiers do to counteract the stomach-churning smells that filled the air? They applied perfume to themselves. As historian Alain Coben put it, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. However, the widespread use of perfumes only exacerbated the already unpleasant stench by adding yet another scent. Human waste was everywhere. Chamber pots were hurriedly thrown out of windows due to a lack of plumbing. Even though Marie Antoinette was said to have been struck by flying waste, passing motorists would need to exercise caution. The pots would have to be transported to one of the nearby waste collection cesspools if they weren't dumped out the window. Many courtiers obeyed nature's call whenever and wherever it was most convenient, as the palace lacked adequate plumbing and had a lot of people. Seeing someone in the act of relieving him or herself wasn't an uncommon sight. The Princess de Harcourt, for one, didn't think twice about urinating in public. In 1702, German-born Princess Elizabeth Charlotte recoiled at the behavior she saw at the French court. The people stationed in the galleries in front of our room piss in all the corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartments without seeing somebody pissing. Louis XIV finally made a point of directing servants to clean up the waste weekly. People thought clean linen was more important than clean skin. He would simply change his shirt when he became too sweaty. A sign of their wealth and status, Louis and his courtiers changed their shirts multiple times a day. Though perfumes allowed users to display their wealth and mask unpleasant smells, body odor was still a problem. After all, it wasn't until the 20th century that underarm deodorants became widely used. The forest around Versailles was compared to an open-air brothel. Versailles wasn't just the seat of royal authority in France. It was also a hotbed of liaisons amongst all classes. After Louis XIV moved his court to Versailles, workers and nobles alike descended on the town. The forest surrounding the palace grounds became a kind of open-air brothel, since sex workers could be solicited there. In light of what he deemed to be the immoral licentiousness of his court and kingdom, Louis vigorously policed sex workers and marked them as sinners. Contrary to Louis's public stances on morality, he maintained numerous mistresses. Oral hygiene was highly prized. After a lifetime of dental problems, Louis XIV was toothless by the time he passed in 1715. His dental problems weren't unique. Decadent sweets made with refined sugar that were popular in France in the 17th century because of colonialism and slavery rotted teeth, and were eaten by French aristocrats. Even though there were a lot of decayed teeth, having a healthy mouth was important to many of the courtiers at Versailles and their ideals of beauty. As described in the 17th century text The School of Venus, a beautiful woman should have even and very white teeth. Courtiers used various powders and mouthwashes to give the appearance of healthy teeth. Due in part to advancements in dentistry, oral hygiene had evolved into a status symbol by the middle of the 18th century. Lice clung to wigs. In an alleged effort to conceal thinning hair, Louis XIV aided in the popularity of wigs in France. Another effect that wigs had was lice, which often infested them rather than a person's scalp. Boiling a lice-covered wig was an easier way to control an infestation than picking the lice out of hair. Though men shaved their heads in order to wear wigs and control lice, women by and large did not. Food sanitation could be dicey and many people had worms. Food was also affected by Versailles' sanitary conditions. The palace's cooks' lives were made more difficult by, for instance, issues with the plumbing. On at least one occasion, sewage seeped into Marie Antoinette's private kitchens and poisoned everything. Though hand-washing was part of Louis XIV's dining ritual, there is evidence that food was not always prepared or handled properly. At Versailles, courtiers had intestinal parasites as a result. Even the king wasn't spared. He had several bouts of tapeworm. During one bout, Louis XIV is said to have relieved himself of a worm that was nearly 6 inches long. The filth was compounded when Louis XIV decided to settle at Versailles. Versailles was never an obvious location for a royal court. It was originally built as a hunting lodge, but it was far from running water, which could carry waste away. Worse, the site was built on shifting sand and marsh, according to one observer. So when Louis XIV decided to move his court there, the already poor hygienic situation at Versailles quickly deteriorated as more people descended on the space. By staying put at Versailles rather than circulating between multiple palaces, as kings had previously done, Louis XIV put an impossible housekeeping burden on the army of servants and caretakers who simply couldn't keep up with the mountains of filth and waste that courtiers produced. The palace grounds were used by feral cats as a litter box. Any visitor to Versailles would have seen cats both domestic and feral throughout the palace estate. Some members of court brought pets, while the heaps of food waste attracted rodents as well as the cats that hunted them. There were even more unsanitary issues brought on by having so many cats. Feline excrement could be spotted all over the grounds. Worse, the remains of deceased cats could be found along the town's main thoroughfare. The indelicacies of Versailles influenced the new colors worn by fashionable courtiers. A pest gave the brownish-reddish-purple color known as puce its name at Versailles. When Marie Antoinette wore a dress in that color in 1775, Louis XVI, her husband, compared it to an unpuce, or flea. The color became popular. The Baroness d'Aubecourt stated, "Every lady at court wore a puce-colored gown, old puce, young puce, ventre de puce, dos de puce, etc." After the birth of Louis XVI heir in 1781, courtiers marked the occasion by wearing a new color. They called it caca dauphin or dauphin poop, because it was as brown as the infant's excrement. Public domain commons Louis XV tried to improve sanitation at the palace. Louis XV, a 5-year-old great-grandson, took over as king after Louis XIV's death in 1715. Recognizing the state of the palace, Louis XV began renovation projects. He made sure that the sewage pipes got longer. This put a greater distance between the palace and its cesspools of human waste. The stark contrast between opulence and filth at the court of Versailles. Hygiene. The court of Versailles, with its gilded halls, sprawling gardens, and extravagant displays of wealth, remains one of history's most iconic symbols of absolute monarchy and aristocratic excess. Yet beneath the shimmering facade of silk, lace, and powdered wigs lay a far less glamorous reality. One of pervasive filth, overwhelming stench, and questionable hygiene practices. Even though Versailles was built to show power, refinement, and divine authority, life inside its walls was often filthy. The palace, home to thousands of nobles, servants, and officials, operated under 17th and 18th century understandings of cleanliness, which differed drastically from modern standards. Far from the pristine image often imagined, Versailles was a place where chamber pots were dumped out windows, public latrines overflowed, and heavy perfumes fought, and often failed, to mask the ever-present reek of human waste and unwashed bodies. Hygiene at Versailles was not merely a matter of personal care but a reflection of broader cultural attitudes toward the body, privacy, and social status. From the Sun King's aversion to bathing to the open-air brothel that the palace grounds became, the realities of cleanliness, or lack thereof, at Versailles reveal a world where appearances mattered far more than actual sanitation. Why Versailles never saw soap and water? The myth of bathing. One of the most striking aspects of hygiene at Versailles was the near absence of bathing. In contrast to today, when people take a shower every day, Europeans in the 17th century, particularly the French aristocracy, viewed immersion in water with great suspicion. Medical theories of the time held that hot water, in particular, could weaken the body by opening pores and allowing disease to enter. The common belief was that warm water weakened the body and widened the pores, allowing diseases to enter, historian Jules Harper writes. People everywhere, not just in France, found it much safer and better for health to have a quick wash than soaking in a tub. King Louis XIV himself reportedly bathed only twice in his entire life, once as a child and once as a treatment for illness. The Sun King and his courtiers relied on other methods of cleanliness instead of washing their entire bodies. Multiple times per day, Louis XIV changed his linen shirts, wiped himself down with a damp cloth, and scrubbed his face and hands with alcohol or scented water. The nobility practiced this method, which was known as dry washing, because they believed that changing undergarments frequently absorbed sweat and dirt, keeping the body clean without the perceived risks of bathing. This denial of water also extended to hair care. Wigs, which became a staple of aristocratic fashion, were rarely washed. Instead, they were powdered heavily with scented starch to mask odors and keep lice at bay. The elaborate hairstyles of women at court, often towering constructions of curls and ornaments, were left untouched for weeks, if not months, leading to infestations of vermin. The idea of immersing oneself in water was so alien that when Louis XV installed a bathtub in his private apartments, it was considered a shocking luxury rather than a hygienic necessity. Waste management in a palace without plumbing. The chamber pot culture. One of the most infamous aspects of hygiene at Versailles was the handling of human waste. Despite its grandeur, the palace lacked a proper sewage system, necessitating the use of chamber pots, commodes, and public latrines by the thousands of residents and visitors. Small private closets referred to as chaise purses, literally pierced chairs, served as basic toilets for high-ranking nobles. These were essentially wooden chairs with a hole in the seat and a chamber pot beneath. Simple pots were used by lower-ranking courtiers and servants, and they were frequently emptied directly into the courtyards below through windows. This practice was so common that walking through Versailles gardens or courtyards required vigilance. Even Queen Marie Antoinette was reportedly struck by falling waste on at least one occasion. There were public latrines, but they were insufficient for the palace's inhabitants. Overflowing and poorly maintained, these facilities leaked sewage into adjacent rooms, creating a pervasive stench that permeated the palace. One court reporter, the Duc de Saint-Simon, wrote in remorse about the foul odors in the corridors, and another visitor wrote that the avenues and courtyards reek of urine and feces. Another hallmark of Versailles hygiene culture was the lack of privacy surrounding bodily functions. Louis XIV was famous for holding court while sitting on his commode and receiving ministers and other dignitaries from abroad. This practice was not considered vulgar but rather a demonstration of the king's accessibility and power. His ability to conduct affairs of state at all times, even in the most intimate moments. Versus perfume stench. Fight against horrible odors. Given the overwhelming smells of sweat, sewage and rotting food, it is no surprise that Versailles became a palace drowning in perfume. Scent was not merely a luxury but a necessity, used to mask the ever-present stench. Potpourri, incense, and scented candles filled rooms as nobles doused themselves in strong floral and musky scents. Yet rather than eliminating bad odors, the excessive use of perfume often made things worse. Some visitors found the nauseating concoction of floral essences, body odor, and human waste unbearable. One observer described Versailles as a place where the air is thick with the scent of roses and excrement. Clothing was also a part of the perfume-obsessed lifestyle. Nobles relied on frequent linen changes to appear to be clean because bathing was uncommon. A shirt that smelled good and was clean was considered the pinnacle of class. A shirt that showed dirt or sweat was considered to be of lower status. Louis XIV reportedly changed his shirt 3 times a day, a habit that underscored his wealth and fastidiousness. Oral hygiene, rotten teeth, and the illusion of beauty. Another area where appearances often took precedence over actual hygiene was dental care at Versailles. The French aristocracy's love of sugar, imported from colonies in the Caribbean, led to widespread tooth decay. Louis XIV himself suffered from severe dental problems, losing most of his teeth by middle age and enduring multiple painful extractions. White teeth were still considered a mark of beauty despite widespread tooth decay. In addition to mouthwashes infused with herbs and spices, courtiers used tooth powders made from crushed shells, charcoal, or alum to clean their teeth. However, these treatments did little to stop the rot. So many nobles used handkerchiefs to cover their stained teeth or posed with their mouths closed in portraits. By the mid-18th century, dentistry had advanced slightly, with the introduction of porcelain dentures and more sophisticated cleaning methods. Yet for most of Versailles' existence, oral hygiene remained rudimentary at best. The gardens of vice. Versailles as a hotbed of sexual license. Hygiene at Versailles was not limited to bodily cleanliness. It also encompassed moral hygiene. The sprawling gardens of the palace, which were designed as a representation of the royal control over the natural world, gained notoriety as a location for illicit encounters. Prostitutes, nobles, and servants alike used the secluded groves for assignations, earning Versailles the nickname, the open-air brothel. Louis XIV publicly condemned such behavior, enforcing strict moral codes and punishing sex workers. However, the king himself had a number of mistresses, including Madame de Montespan and Madame de Maintenon, so there was a lot of hypocrisy. The double standard was clear. While the aristocracy indulged in extramarital affairs, the lower classes faced harsh penalties for the same acts. A palace of contradictions. In the end, Versailles was a place of stark contrasts, between splendor and squalor, between the illusion of perfection and the reality of filth. Hygiene practices at the court reflected broader 17th and 18th century beliefs about the body, health, and social hierarchy. Even though the nobility made great efforts to present a pristine and refined appearance, their actual behavior was frequently far from hygienic. The palace's lack of proper sanitation, aversion to bathing, and reliance on perfume over washing created an environment that was as noxious as it was opulent. Yet these very contradictions reveal much about the era's values. At Versailles, what mattered most was not true cleanliness, but the appearance of it. Even the most private actions like washing, disposing of waste, and taking care of one's body were part of the grand theater of absolutism in a world where power was performative. Ultimately, the hygiene of Versailles serves as a reminder that history's most glittering courts were often far dirtier than they seemed. Behind the gold leaf and silk stockings lay a world where chamber pots were dumped with abandon, where perfumes fought a losing battle against stench, and where the Sun King himself ruled from a throne that doubled as a toilet.